Okay, so we'll get started. We'll all introduce ourselves and then we'll each do a short presentation and then open up obviously to questions. So I'll start with myself. I'm Judith van der Velde, as opposed to Judith van der Ville, which was in the form. But Judith van der Velde, I'm the senior educator at the Jewish Museum. I've been there for about 8 years and I deliver programs in Judaism, Holocaust and also history. And obviously today I'm going to focus on delivering Judaism. Most of our visits from school groups are not Jewish. It's probably about 95% of school-age visitors to the Jewish Museum are not Jewish. So I am quite used to delivering Judaism to non-Jews, hence my being invited to the conference today.
I'm Jerry Cohen. I'm the head of RE at William Ellis, which is a boys' school in West Hampstead. And I've been teaching RE for 10 years officially, but unofficially I've been going into schools a lot, holding workshops, and I do a lot of demonstrations or explanations about Passover and different things like that. I've been involved in interfaith work for about 30 years, and so hopefully some of what we'll do today will resonate with you, and you can have conversations with any of us later to book up other things.
Hi, I'm Sammy Rota. I'm a primary school teacher. I currently work in Hertfordshire. I teach reception. Previously, I've been teaching for 4 years now. Previously, I was teaching Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, and I was RE coordinator in my previous schools. And last year, I taught in Australia for a year and worked in a faith school as well and public school. So I'm just here just to give you a little. Just to tell you kind of like how I would approach Judaism and teaching Judaism to primary school children. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, so I've managed to take some artefacts from the museum. Don't tell the curators. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually start with handling some objects, because I think that is a really good way of opening up discussion to Judaism. And we decided that we'd use something that was, well, first of all, quite portable, seeing as I was coming here on the tube, but also something that you could probably buy, and also something that you could easily replicate in the classroom. So I'm going to ask the group, the people at the back, to stand up and to come to the front. First of all, because I want you sitting near at the front. No, that's you guys, yeah? First because I want you sitting near the front, and second of all, you can do a job for me, seeing as I seem to need to be tied to the mic. So we'll come round with some goodies. So just have a look, take one out. You should recognise what it is. Don't worry if you don't, I will expand. Yeah. So is that better, because you can hear, I could hear you straining, so it might be less distracting. Just a quick show of hands, has anyone been to the Jewish Museum in Camden? So a couple of you, okay. So we have about 16,000 school visitors a year, so we are quite busy, but we always have room for a few more. And we work with both primary and secondary. So, let's see. Any ideas what you are holding? You've got something a little bit different from everyone else. I'll come on to you in a minute. So for those of you who do teach Judaism, do you use artefacts? Do you use objects? And you might get a loan box from the library or local museum. We're looking at developing one at the museum as well, because we find it very, very helpful way of accessing something. So any ideas what we have? Any idea? I can hear some mumblings, the right thing? It's a mezuzah. Okay, so we have a mezuzah. And does anyone want to expand on what a mezuzah is? Anyone know what it is? Anyone seen one before? Goes on the doorpost. Okay, it goes on the doorpost, and inside should be a small prayer. I don't know if any of you have got one which has actually got something inside. Yours has got something inside. Some of them haven't. You've got just the prayer that goes inside. Jerry's going to expand on the content of the text inside, but you might well know the first word of the prayer. Here, yes, Shema Yisrael. So it's a prayer that is repeated in the Torah, and it's one that appears in various different forms within a Jewish household. I've chosen a mezuzah partly because Jerry really wanted to do the text of the Shema, but also because I think it's really important that when we talk about Judaism, we don't just talk about Judaism as in the synagogue. We talk about Judaism where actually it takes place for many, many Jewish families is within the home. And so I think starting with an object that is home-based, I think all of a sudden makes it more relevant and accessible. So I'll say to students, where would you see a mezuzah in my home? And they'll start to answer, well, where do you think you'd see them in my home? Any ideas? So we said on the door, but which door? Front door, absolutely. As soon as you arrive at my house, you'd know it was a Jewish house. We have a mezuzah on the front door. But, for example, your one there, who do you think might own that one? So do you want to just say a little bit about what it is? And I'll repeat it. It does. It has Noah's Ark. Absolutely. It's on a child's bedroom door. And you will see, I haven't handed out some particularly exciting ones. There's a couple, you've got one there that's quite a popular one from the sort of 60s and 70s. So you'll see certain ones are perhaps from a certain period of time. But you can get a huge variety. My favourite one, which I'm yet to see anywhere apart from online, is one that looks like a sushi roll that was from a kosher Japanese restaurant. But there really is quite a lot of freedom. You get football ones. In fact, I didn't bring it because it's actually nailed to my son's bedroom door. But he has a football one. So I think that idea of the complexity of identity, that you will be both Jewish and also a football fan, a sushi eater, whatever it is also quite a fun way. So if you don't manage to buy a mezuzah, go online, see if you can find the Simpsons mezuzah, which is quite fun. Obviously, we've got more traditional ones like Noah's Ark. The ones I've handed out today tend to be a little bit more traditional. Another thing I wanted to show to you today was how you can access a resource online as well. We've been working closely with teachers to devise a website. So it's on our Jewish Museum website, and it's the bit in the middle that says Teachers' Resources, Objects and Focus. Now, I'm not going to show you the live website because it was too complicated. So this is a slideshow, so I can click through. So you click onto Teachers' Resources, and you have the 4 strands of topics that we concentrate on at the museum. 3 strands. We've got Discovering Judaism, we've got, it's a bit far for me to read, Exploring History and Investigating the Holocaust, and then we've got Identifying Themes. And we change, some of the objects are permanent on the website, and others are more topical. So the one there is a donation book, for example. So there are all sorts of different things. What I thought would be interesting to show you today was the one relating to the mezuzah. So you can see we've got a number of different images. All of the objects on this page are actually on display at the Jewish Museum. So it's rather nice if you are visiting the museum, you let your students see them online, and then when they see them, there's a little bit of awe and wonder at seeing the object itself. But of course, not everyone can get to the Jewish Museum in London, and so this is a resource that's open to everybody. So if you clicked onto the mezuzah one of the best features on this is the fact that you can research both the provenance of the mezuzah, or whatever object it is itself, the history of it, also the context, when it's used and why it's used. And then here's quite nice because you see an open one, and often you don't see that. You'll see mezuzot, but you won't actually see them open. You won't see the text that's inside. And what I rather like, so here we have the story of the object and a zoom function, which is fantastic. Bearing in mind how small the mezuzah is, it's a really great function on our website to see. And we have a few different ones. We have one in the gallery that's a bone mezuzah. We chose to put a silver one on because it's a little bit more typical. Just to say a little bit about the parchment inside, and you noted that you had a feather. I gave you a turkey feather to look at. Any ideas why I handed that to you? What's that got to do with the mezuzah? It is. It's written by a scribe, written by hand, and it's written in ink, the traditional way. So on parchment and using a quill and ink. And there are quite a lot of rules, similar to the rules that are in the Torah, that writing a Torah, you have the same rules on the small bit of parchment. And again, it might be a nice way of accessing the real text. A piece of parchment inside a mezuzah costs about £50. To buy a real Torah scroll is in the up to hundreds of thousands of pounds. So it's quite a nice way of having something that's genuine. And we use the word kashrut. We use the word that we usually apply to food to describe whether the text is kosher or not. And there are a lot of rules about how you should write a mezuzah text. Often it's written by a sophet, a Torah scribe, and the letters, for example, are not allowed to touch, which is an art in itself, and they're often very, very tiny. So it's also a way of exploring the care that's taken when making a religious item by using the mezuzah, by using the mezuzah scroll. What we sometimes do at the museum, because we have such a high quantity of students coming through, they'll see the mezuzah scroll, but it will be packed up, but then we'll have enlarged photocopies, which you're entitled to do. Something to note is that if you're disposing of Jewish texts, of course, you should therefore try and ensure that they're not just thrown in the bin. They should be treated with respect. And the Jewish way is to actually bury them. And if you do have a school that's relatively near a synagogue, you can just take things to the synagogue and they will ensure that they're buried appropriately. So, nice way of exploring the idea. We also have some things for teachers to do. This is something we need to work on a little bit more, but at the moment we have for this one, how to make your own mezuzah, and something very easy to do in the classroom. I don't think it's necessary to ask the students to write out the prayer in Hebrew, but you might want to just try writing some Hebrew letters. You can think of what would be your motto on your bedroom. Jerry's going to talk about the content of the text and why we have that text, but your students might then be able to explore what would be their mantra, something that they want to remind themselves of on a daily basis. Maybe it'll be something as simple as, don't forget your packed lunch and don't hit your younger brother. That might be a good one in my family, but maybe it could be something that's a little bit more spiritual and more, give them an open flat platform. We used to do this quite often, this activity at the museum, but we felt it wasn't a particularly good time of their time in the museum. We'd rather they were handling artifacts, looking around the gallery. So we decided, actually, this is a perfect thing to do in the classroom. All you need is card, felt tips, bit of sellotape, and you're away. And they can look really beautiful, and they can also explore different sorts of designs as well. So again, you can give your students a task to explore different mezuzah designs, and they can also do these which reflect their own identity as well. So it both reflects the idea of Jewish objects as being something special, and also the idea of Jewish objects being something that someone has taken care to make and is made in the traditional way. And it's something that goes across communities. So you can go to a home in America, a home in South Africa, a home in Britain, and you will see the mezuzah and this idea of continuity. But then you'll have the idea of local flavours and local interpretations, like having your football team or having the sushi or whatever it is. So I hope that you're able to make use of the Jewish Museum's website and to use Objects in Focus as a springboard for lessons on Judaism. And, in your own time, explore it and see. We've chosen the objects in consultation with teachers, and we hope that they are really useful for you to use in your classroom. And one last thing before I hand over to Jerry. I've brought some brochures as well about the learning programmes for primary schools and secondary schools. I've got some up here. There's also some at the front desk. But obviously, who needs print these days? Just go onto our website and it's all there. Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah. Forgot to do that. Yeah, while Jerry's setting up, that's fine, yeah. You can buy a little one, a model one, and they're about £30. They're not real. They're written. They're basically computer generated. They're printed. We use those at the museum for handling, so they're absolutely fine. Definitely get those for your classroom. That's a good question. They are used interchangeably, but I would say
interchangeable.
it should be. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Actually, I'll have to look up that. I can tell you that in the Jewish community in Britain, on the whole, mezuzah means both the case and the parchment. And yes, if you're ever buying one, just check. They do usually sell them separately. And what I didn't mention was you're actually meant to check your mezuzah twice every 7 years, I think it is, to check that there isn't any damage. The box doesn't matter. In fact, what you can do is just have the mezuzah scroll rolled up in a little bit of cling film, or you can have that. The scroll's the important bit, but the box is the bit where there's a bit more freedom and creativity.
You also wouldn't. Oh, sorry. You also wouldn't have them. You would have them on every door in the house, apart from the bathroom and the toilet, because obviously they're very private places, and you wouldn't have that sort of on there. But everywhere else, yeah.
Brilliant. What we're trying to do is make it real for everyday people. When we come into a classroom and we're trying to help students understand something, we're looking at what happens in a particular faith, but we're also saying how do our students make use of it. So hopefully in the next few minutes what we're trying to do is demonstrate a little bit of that. You'll see the image at the bottom of the corner there. It does work. There you go. And you'll see it on your little handouts. And you'll see this quite often for those of us who happen to like Star Trek. But it happened a long time before that. And I'll go into that in a little while. We're trying to think about the ways that we start off. Typically, we would say to a student or a group of students, we'll give them something. By the way, if you want this copied, then I'll send it to you. It saves time having to go click. We'll give them a handout, a sheet, a piece of paper, something that I, for example, have given you, a series of pictures. And then what I want you to do right now is, with the person next to you, in your table groups, as we say, or something like that, you have a minute to tell each other everything you can about it. So you've got a sheet of pictures, so you now have a minute to tell each other. Let's see if you do it the way I expect. That's the one. So have a little look. Okay.
Oh, really?
Okay. Right. There you go.
Right, you're going to come over to me.
Good.
Yeah.
20 seconds. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and turning round. Now, we're used to that sort of idea, aren't we? But I don't know whether you did what I really asked you to do. Because what I asked you to do was to tell each other. I don't know if you told each other, or did one of you tell and the other one listen all the time. There's a very old tradition in Judaism of Chavurah, and you can see the little image at the bottom there of two people talking, and there's a bit of a link over. And sometimes you want your students to really get involved, to talk at each other, to tell each other, to get involved, to have the conversation going. Because what you don't really want is one person just listening and taking it in, nothing happens. Get them excited, perhaps by whether it's the image, whether it's physically handling something, and you'd be surprised what happens. There's a lot of tradition that goes on when we do learning in Judaism, that we speak and we tell and we discuss and we really get involved. You can tell that the disciples were Jewish. The disciples of Jesus were Jewish. You think about the scene at the Last Supper, and Jesus asks them a question. Being Jewish, of course, he asks questions, and they say, "Well, who's going to do this? Who's the one who's going to betray?" And they all start. It says they start talking to each other. And there's such a hubbub going on. In Judaism, we ask questions. We ask a lot of questions. One of the most famous questions that Jesus was asked was, what is the greatest commandment? And that's Matthew 22:37. And he responds from Deuteronomy, the first and greatest commandment. So when we encourage students to do something, we encourage them to talk together, to get involved. We encourage them to actually make what I've called a verbal Venn diagram. The overlap between one conversation and another is where I think the deeper learning goes, because they take that and they make something more of it. So the conversation that you have goes along this line. What have we got in front of us? We've got a prayer. How does it begin? It begins with sh. It's Shema. And I'm not going to say the prayer loudly because of the other thing. But in synagogue, it's a really loud declaration. The Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad is the same kind of way that for many Christians, or probably for many children in your classroom, they know the Lord's Prayer, whether they're Christian or not. In the same way for Jewish people, it's a prayer we know. But it's a prayer to say, shh, listen. We've really got to pay attention because it's incredibly important. And this is the kind of thing that it tells us. It tells us that it's so important that we have to prepare ourselves in prayer. We have to get to grips with what we're doing. The first bit is a declaration. We're telling everybody who God is. In that sense, we're putting out our table. We're saying, this is who we are, this is what we do. So when I've said at the bottom of some of the slides, it says, how did Jewish people express their faith and identity? One of it is in what's around our house on the doorposts. Another one is how we express that, how we say that in our synagogues and in our prayers. But we say it so many times. I guess when you think about it, if something's important, you'll say it a lot. I do distinctly remember telling my wife that I love her when I first married her. I believe I have probably said it on occasion since then. The truth is still there. If I don't say it, it doesn't mean to say I don't love her, but I think she probably likes to hear it more than just once or twice. So the Shema, which is something that we say traditionally on waking, we might say it's called the bedtime prayer. Children, it's one of those things that children learn. So that idea is it's within our society, it's within what we do. But more than that, it's where it is. You've seen the mezuzot, and you've seen where they are. Bedtime, waking. You might have seen images on the web, or you might have seen film, you might have seen that Jewish men wear a box on the front there, on their arm, this tefillin, because the command is to have it at your heart. When you've got it on the tefillin box and you have your hand in there, it's close to your heart. It's like frontlets, or it's like a gatepost to cause you to think about what you're saying, to think about what you're doing. Now, you don't tend to walk around with them all day long, but it's something that some Jewish people do. They put it on and they say, this is how my way is going to be for the day. When you go out, when you come in, it's on the gates. You talk about it with your kids. It's the sort of thing that they say, it's so important. So what I'm trying to say for us, really, is it's an ordinary, normal thing, rather than being so spiritual that we have to reserve it just on once or twice a year. It should be every day. So what about writing them? We write them, as we said, a sofer will write it. There's a new series of films that Lat Blaylock has organised, and you'll notice one about Judaism, and it goes through the way that the sofer writes this, and the idea of it being kashrut. So, what really links this? I might say to students, here are 6 things. And I might ask them to look at the pictures, or I might them to make up for themselves. If they've got 6 parts of pie, I come from a Trivial Pursuit age, but then I'll say, here's some images. What are they to do with your ideas? First, for example. And then, looking through what happens in a daytime. What do you do that makes you specially who you are as a human being? And I guess, in a sense, it's not necessarily religious things, but there are certain things in their lives. And you say, that's what makes you you. That's what makes you special. And you can use that as a parallel for the 6 things that I've mentioned, writing them on the doorposts, talking about them when you get up, when you go to bed, when you walk around, and so on. And you pick your pie and you put those bits in. There's so many things you can do. That's the important thing for me to remember about the stretching that takes place. Once you've had a conversation in your classes, in your groups, get them to say, well, this is what we figured out. This is what we found out. Turn the classroom around a little bit and get them to teach each other and to teach you. Hope it helps. Hope it makes you understand a little bit more. Hope it stretches your thinking. Get them to apply the model that we've given, and then you'll be providing them with yet another part of their toolkit, if you like. I know we have question time, but I don't know if there's anything particular that comes to mind. But yes, indeed. If you notice one of the images on the mezuzah, you'll see that kind of shape. The first letter of the Hebrew word Shaddai, which means the Almighty One, is the Hebrew letter Shin. And that image is the letter Shin. Leonard Nimoy, as a Jewish boy in Boston, when he went to synagogue on the Day of Atonement, he was told never to look at the Kohanim, the priests who were giving the blessing, and they would have their hands outstretched over the congregation, providing the blessing. And he kind of peeked one day, didn't get struck by lightning and realised it wasn't so bad, and he thought, that's something special. And when eventually he took the part of Spock in Star Trek, he was looking for something that said, I'm different, I'm special. And he came up with that idea, that separation. So, Jewish aliens, not bad. But it's also the idea that this is recognisable for Jewish people. And when we put the tefillin on and we bind it round, we again make the sign of the shin on our hand, all sorts of ways. Thanks. Yes. Sorry.
Just a question about the practice of not writing the name of God.
Yes.
From it. Do you think that when we teach, that should be something that we're doing when we're teaching Judaism? And secondly, why is it not done in the transliteration of Hebrew? Why is Adonai written, but you can't write?
Good question. The idea of writing the name of God in full, for me, from the tradition I come from, I tend to write the English without the vowel. It's the way I've been brought up as a matter of respect. But also, we talk about the idea of what is that used for? Is it permanent? Is it going to be thrown away? If it's going to be thrown away, it has to be respectfully disposed of. For some people, I have seen the word Adonai written without vowels, but it's unusual. The name God and Lord as well. I don't mind which way somebody writes it, and as for you as a practitioner, you might want to say, this is how traditionally it's done, but because you don't do it every day, it's going to be a bit difficult for you to think, oh, right, it's a Judaism lesson, so I miss it out, but in Christianity I'll keep it, and in an Islam lesson I'll have to write Allah, or one of the other 98. And so I guess part of it is, what are you used to doing? If you explain to the students that this is a traditional way, it's quite nice for them to know, but I wouldn't ask you to change your process. Thanks. Yes?
I teach in a part of London where I feel there's a lot of anti-Semitism, and it's something that I've dealt with discreetly as a lesson.
Sure.
And I feel that one of the things I'd like to do is to get the rabbi in to speak to children, and to speak sort of confidently from a position of faith,
Yes.
because that's not something that I can do, nor do we have any teachers who aren't Jewish. So is there a network of people that someone I can ring and say, these are the dates that we have available? Could someone come in and speak to us about home life, religion, anything?
Finding a network of people who can come in from a Judaism point of view. There are some organisations that we can put you in contact with. I do it myself with nice, kind words to my head teacher. But it is interesting what you've said, that it's not necessarily something you can do yourself in your own situation, in your own school. And we have to be aware that I'm quite happy to step back from my own personal belief, because I'm teaching, as we all do, we teach many different faiths. But it's quite often a good thing to actually get involved. There's certainly speakers who can come in. There's certainly, you know, as I say, I do these sort of things as well. But we can, very happy to do.
Can I just say that as well? So the other one thing to do is, if you're in a place which is near a synagogue, is to contact the local synagogue. We run a workshop at the museum. Are you in London? Okay, so we run, yeah, exactly. We run local, so London-based. I run a workshop called Connecting Lives, which goes specifically into secondary schools, where there is anti-Semitism identified by the teachers, and it's a very light touch. So what we do is we take in artefacts in order to have conversations, and depending on the group, we take in different things. So I do a lot of work in Tower Hamlets, which obviously has a high Muslim population, and so then I'll take in objects that I know will develop discussion. So a tzedakah box, which is a charity box in Judaism, or I might take in a kippah like this, which is Moroccan, and we start to talk, or I'll take in Haribo sweets, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, about food. The idea that there is commonality, but there's also difference. And I think it's really important to deliver it, but to do it with authenticity. And that's really what you're getting to, is the fact that it feels a little bit lacking in substance to just say, oh, don't say that about Jewish people. What they need to do is to have a safe space in which to ask quite difficult questions. So I've set up, and we've got some funding, so hopefully it's going to become a national programme possibly, but it will become definitely a London programme called Connecting Lives, which enables exactly this, for this to happen. At the moment it's secondary school, because I think that's probably where the need is greater. And we're very sympathetic. We know that it usually comes from a place of ignorance rather than hatred, and that it's very hard. The Jewish community is such a tiny community. It's very hard to have examples within your own school body to say, oh, well, so-and-so's Jewish. We're just not out there, and we're very much isolated in our own bubble, and that's part of the problem as well. So there are lots of people addressing it. You have Jerry, you have other people, you have synagogues. There's lots of different ways, but feel free to ask the museum. I mean, we are making quite good efforts, and there's some very good things going on in the north of England as well, because at the moment we don't reach that far.
Did you have anything on that?
Continuing from that kind of led quite nicely on to sort of how I would approach teaching Judaism, or really any religion, in primary education. Are there any primary school teachers here? Oh, hey. I would, the way that I go about it, and the way that I would go about it, is making sure that it's relevant to my children. You know, I feel that there is a stigma attached to religious education in primary education. It's a subject that I have personally found it's perhaps taught by, supply teachers or PPA staff, or it's a subject that sort of gets dropped when there's such a strong focus on maths and English. And I completely understand that obviously is, a big priority for schools, but currently I teach reception, and a prime area of learning is personal, social and emotional development for children, and a specific area of learning is understanding of the world. And if we're going to make sure that our children are finding out about their identity and about learning about how to build relationships with other people, obviously religious education comes as a massive part of that. So it is, it's not given enough importance in primary education. So the way that I would perhaps go about a session, which I have done before when I used to teach year 3 and 4, would be I actually had lots of different foods laid out in my classroom. I had Cocoa Pops, I had Heinz tomato ketchup, I had some dairy milk. I had lots of different things all around the room, and I asked my children to just go around and take a little look at the foods, all the foods that they're familiar with, that they have, that they love, and encourage them to think about why I've put that out there, and what is similar about these foods, and perhaps how that relates to Judaism. And it created a fantastic discussion about it, because I led on to looking at kosher food and the kosher home. Heinz tomato ketchup is kosher. Rivita has a kosher, it's called a chesher. It has a chesher on it to say that it's kosher. Cocoa Pops, kosher. And these are all foods that perhaps you wouldn't know are kosher, but they are. And you can actually get a kosher food guide if you look online, there is a kosher food guide which would give you a list of those foods. Personally, my children absolutely loved it. I actually had parents coming up to me for a few weeks after saying that their children had been like tearing apart their cupboards, finding all the kosher food, and they were coming up to me after school, speaking to me in pain about how their whole kitchen had been sort of like explored. So that would be sort of how I would go about making sure that it's really, really relevant to the children, so that they can relate to that and they can see that this is sort of, you know, part of a kosher home, a Jewish home, perhaps. Those sort of traditions are something they can relate to. And for me personally, sort of my home life, my family, my approach to Judaism is very much centres from the home and from how I've been brought up and the traditions that I have with my family and things like that. And I think that's really important for the children to be exploring. So that would be the sort of thing that I would be looking at doing to make it relevant. I've also run, but sort of like before those sort of sessions that I've done with my children, I've looked at things like what is a God? And for children, you know, sometimes, you know, the word God is sort of flung about. It might be, you know, brought up in collective worship, in assembly, sorts of things. And I did, with my children, I ran a session, I just gave them a piece of paper and I just literally at the top, it just said, what is a God to you? Some of my children left it blank because they didn't know, and that's fine, that's fantastic. One of my other little year threes put that they think it's like a marshmallow person in the clouds. Somebody else said it's a princess in a castle in the clouds, and all those sorts of things. And I think that it's really important for us to actually gauge what the children know and what their idea is of religion and of sort of like what that means to them even before going into those sort of specifics, so that you can really personalise that learning for them. So I just wanted to give you sort of like a bit of a background of sort of like the things I do. I think that I think people are scared of teaching RE in primary school because obviously you need to really sort of like up your subject knowledge. But there are so many resources available, and it's all about making sure that, you know, you're listening to your children, you're involving them, and you're making their learning experiences personalised. So I just wanted to give you like a little, just a bit of information about what I sort of do. And I wanted to know if there's anything that you would want to ask about how you would approach it. Because obviously those sorts of approaches you can take into secondary school as well. But sort of what would you want to know about sort of ways to teach it? Because I like doing sort of like creative, sort of like runabout sessions. I was asked to teach Judaism in a school in Essex, and I went and I got a class list of all the children's names, and I translated all their names into Hebrew, and I sort of scattered their names around the classroom and got them to go on like a little like treasure hunt. And they were the teachers didn't know what had happened, but all the children found it really exciting to see that. And that's just sort of like a fun way to get them involved. So is there anything sort of like you would like to ask?
I would like to ask you, I have very little time to teach so many religions,
Yeah.
so many concepts. So
Yeah.
I try to do some projects where the kids can do something we cannot do in class.
Yeah.
So extended projects.
Yeah.
In terms of the religious festivals, which I found fantastic to teach the ethos,
Yeah.
our belief, which those festivals, because I found very hard to choose which ones. I have my personal views on it, but it would be nice asking you which one I should be teaching the kids.
I think it's hard to pick sort of a specific, but you can relate lots of them together. Like festivals of lights, so you can look at Christmas, Hanukkah, Diwali, and you can sort of make those links between those festivals for the different religions and things like that. But I mean, you've got the key ones like coming up now. Obviously, you've got Easter, but you've also got Passover for Jewish people, which is coming up. So they're sort of, around the same sort of time. I think it is really hard to sort of say, yeah.
I think what we try to do at the museum is we try, if we can, to keep it in time to the year, if we can. But that doesn't mean that I'm not teaching Passover right the way from September. I would say personally, I would not prioritise Hanukkah. I think that Hanukkah has been very much inflated, and it's not actually the most important festival. So for me, I would say Passover is incredibly important, and also leads to very interesting discussions as well. So there's a richness to the festival. Another festival that's often overlooked and is incredibly important is, of course, Shabbat. And you can do that any time during the year. And I think that gives a much truer sense of Jewish life. So I think my gut feeling, and this is what we do in the museum, is this tends to be what schools want, is Shabbat and Passover in the main. Occasionally, we'll get asked to do sort of an overview of the Jewish year, so starting with Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, right the way through, and the idea of a cycle as well. I think if you do focus on one festival, it's always worth putting it in the context of others, because I would hate for a student to leave thinking there was only one festival, because I think that's one of the lovely things about Judaism is there are so many festivals. But for what it's worth for me, I would say Shabbat and Passover, I think, give you a very good idea. They're also Torah-based festivals, and so I think in terms of covering themes and meaning, I think you'll have quite a good starting point.
Thinking about the year of starting in September as well, it's quite a good introduction because September, October is typically the time for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and we say we're making a new start in Judaism. You might be making a new start in Year 7 or in primary or going into GCSE, and it's surprising what that does for a student to say this is where we're beginning. Question?
Yeah, thanks for stuff like artifacts and so on. Is there any music that you would use or recommend as well?
I have used previously, again, to make it relevant, for the sort of upper, well, Key Stage 2. I've actually used somebody called Matisyahu. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's like a Jewish reggae artist, and I've used some of his songs. He did a really good collaboration with Akon called One Day, and it's all about, I mean, I would 100% recommend YouTubing it, about sort of, living in peace and working together and things like that. And that, obviously, I've looked at traditional Jewish music. You've got the, Jewish music that you would see at celebrations, Hava Nagila, all the sorts of traditional music. But again, to make it, relevant to today and to really sort of like engage the children as well. That I've taken that sort of approach myself.
There's a few different things. One of the things we're hoping to do next stage for the website is to actually upload short sounds, which was actually in response to students. We had a school that analysed it and said, we want sounds. So we've got very basic things. So, for example, with the mezuzah, you will hear someone reciting the Shema. If you go to Purim, which is another festival, you'll actually hear me laning. That means singing through the Megillah, the special, just a section of it. So you'll have something like that. If you want something fun, going back to the to fill in the boxes and the wrapping around. There are some young men, I think they're now back in America, but they were living in Israel, and they're called 613. Yes. Is that right? 613. Yeah. And they have made some really fun songs, and the one I'm thinking of for Tefillin was to a Black Eyed Peas song from a few years ago. See if you can work out which one. And it's called I've Got Tefillin. They are really naff. They need to be put in a context of just a bit of fun. There's a great one for Hanukkah. There's one that's just come out now for Purim, which is not by them, by someone else. For Passover. That's not by them. But that's quite a fun way. But also, it's worth looking at. There's some quite famous synagogue choirs who you can also access their music as well. And I think it's really lovely if you can bring in sound, but it's something that we actually didn't think was a priority, and we've actually had to go back and redesign so that we can insert more audio. So I'm glad you'll appreciate it.
613.
613.
There are lots of parodies and things like that as well, which are,
613 is the number of rules in the Torah, so that's what they've called themselves, 613. And Google them, and there's another one as well.
There's the Maccabees.
The Maccabees.
Yeah, Maccabees.
And
equally tacky.
I'm known in my school as the kosher crooner. I take my guitar in, and we have times when I use music with all sorts of things. But it's also the idea of, as you say, when they hear the prayers being chanted in a traditional way as well, that's part of it as well, which some of us are able to do, or you have links online.
This question might not come out correctly, but from a Catholic Christian tradition, there's always the danger. I mean, John Paul II used to did a lot of mind changing with the idea of Judaism as discounted elder brother.
Yes.
Trying to reframe the points of reference. It's just a question, a dangerous question maybe. What is the thing that Christians do or teach that does your head in most? You know, because there is that danger that because of that shared tradition,
Yes.
we can colonise by accident, I think sometimes. But the best will in the world, we come across as the most patronising bunch of self-regarding, etc. What are we as teachers, what should we really avoid?
I suppose part of the difficulty that we have, because we teach a number of different faiths, is where a faith says, I am the way. And obviously in John chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus says that he is haderech, the way. And for some people, they find that difficult to comprehend that it's the only way. And partly depends on how you explain that, how you talk to your students about that. Because you can have pluralist views, you can have a view that says this is the only possible route. And that's obviously something that certainly at Key Stage 4 we go into. But I think what I tend to do is say, look at how similar we are, rather than say, look how much we get on each other's nerves. And it actually helps to build up an idea that a student would be interested in learning about Islam and Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, whatever it happens to be, whatever the viewpoint of the teacher, because we must put that aside and be able to teach fairly.
It's more the way we present Judaism as Christian teachers, by and large.
My experience is that actually the students coming from particularly the Catholic and Church of England schools are very well prepared. And what's probably the hardest thing to do is to teach a faith to people of no faith is much harder. So I think when you have the reference points, I suppose if you're asking, what do I get irritated by? I get irritated by, them saying, oh, we've got Christmas, you've got Hanukkah. And I'm like, that sort of on that level, nothing very, very significant. I think it's also, I'm amazed how many students don't know that Jews only believe in one God, that Jesus is not part of the Jewish text, those sorts of things, but they're very easily addressed. I think on the whole, we are very, very well served by the Catholic and Church of England schools. I think they teach Judaism very, very well, and I think that there's a lot of mutual respect, which is great. What's really hard is teaching students for whom there's no cultural diversity in their school, or where there's no real sense of who they are themselves, much harder.
I inspect Catholic schools, and where I've seen Judaism put badly is where teaching staff think that teaching Judaism from first century Palestine is sufficient. And sometimes...
Where's Palestine?
So my call would be that we teach living faith, that we don't teach the faith of 2,000 years ago. All faiths have moved on, so we have to be careful at historical context. And that real danger that you're teaching the New Testament and you think you've done Judaism. And that's why...
Yeah. Also, it's worth remembering a lot of students, their other encounter with Jewish people. So first of all, they've got it in the sort of biblical time, so they think there are no Jewish people around because that was ages ago. And then, of course, if they're studying the Holocaust as well, that's also layering on and understanding that all Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust. And so a lot of students do arrive at the Jewish Museum, perhaps not helped by the fact that we're called a museum as well. So that also feeds in with the idea that there's going to be nothing new. And that's why, for example, one of my favourite objects, I haven't brought it today because I couldn't find it, but is a kippah that belongs to my son, which is a Liverpool Football Club kippah, something that's very contemporary, and that's similar with the tomato ketchup or using Haribo sweets, a way of bringing it to everyday life rather than this rather special people who, had beards and more smocks, and, that's where we are, or bearing in mind also the more recent history of the Holocaust. So there's some sort of way of doing that. And schools do this in a various way, and it's very different. It's interesting to contrast with America, where Jewish people are so much more prominent. Everybody knows maybe someone famous, but they know someone Jewish, whereas I think in Britain we're not really there. Our community is very small, and a lot of people do not really, in the public eye, aren't necessarily recognised as being Jewish.
I often get, oh, you don't look Jewish. That's the response I often get. I'm thinking, okay, we need, because I'm not, dressed in the way that they seem to think, you know, from years ago, and perhaps, you know, the different denominations of Judaism. So I often get that as well, which obviously is a misconception in itself about the different denominations of Judaism, the fact that, you know, a Jewish person isn't just one, you know, one way, that, you know, like we're all Jewish, but obviously we're all clearly, you know, different. So, yeah.
Certainly going into pretty well every school that I've taught at over the years, some student has come up to me and say, "You're the first Jewish person I've ever met."
Yeah.
And I might point out to them 3 or 4 other members of staff who are Jewish, and they go, "Oh, how can they be?"
Yeah. And celebrities as well.
It's
with
yes,
that.
indeed.
Yeah, celebrities as
Yes,
well,
that's
but,
great fun. Online, I've got a quiz that spot the Jewish celebrity. I'll give it away. The answer is they're all, and actually there's 100 people, including John Wayne.
Who the students don't know.
But there we go. Thank you very much. I think it's kind of
that's
packed
it.
time.
That's a wrap.
Thank you.